I have had quite a few questions come in that our community have asked on what you're curious about.
What are your top 3 digital nomad hotspots? How do you create a sense of family when yours is so far away? How do you stay regulated when there is so much constant change and uncertainty? Where in the world do you feel the most at home?
Home is simply where the people that I love are. And so a question that I've started asking is less where feels like home and more where are the people that I love. Because wherever they are, that's where home is. Family is a feeling that you can choose. Family is also something that you can create of your own accord. If you don't foster a true sense of belonging within yourself, there is nowhere in the world that will ever feel like home. I have had quite a few questions come in, and I'm going to get my producer Hayden to shoot some of those cues out that our community have asked and shed some light on how to do this and what you're curious about.
All right, here's some questions from the audience. What are your top 3 digital nomad hotspots?
Okay. So I feel like this changes all the time, but there's 2 ways of looking at this. Number 1 is where are the cities that are like really popping off, where there's a lot of people going, a lot of, movement and expats and nomads, where there's like a great, vibrant community. And then the other way of looking at it is where have I personally had the best experiences? So I'm going to look at the first frame of reference and go, okay, places that I've been where I feel like there's a very strong community. I would say the number 1 community is definitely in Bali. And I think it's just because it probably has the oldest culture of that. Everywhere I've gone and I've assimilated and integrated, I just kept going back to Bali for a reason. And it's just one of the easiest places to live for expats. And I think that there's so many reasons why that's the case. I think that a really big part of it is the technology and the ease of getting whatever you need via the Gojek app. I think that the cost of living is very in your favor as a Westerner. But I also just think that there's like a mass of people, which makes the expat and nomad community big enough that you just feel like it's so easeful. Other places where I feel like there's a really great culture of nomads, I definitely feel like there's a big culture in Lisbon, and I feel like that's grown a lot over the last 4 years, especially since I was there last. I have a lot more friends now than I did before, and I feel like there are more entrepreneurs that have moved there and they've built more of a culture there. I think that there's a really big nomad culture in Tulum. I think that there's a pretty big culture in Nosara. And I think that there are some like pockets of Europe where there are big cultures as well. Like there are places that used to have a big culture that I'm not sure if they really do anymore. Chiang Mai used to have a pretty big culture, but I'm not sure what that's like now. I know that Koh Phangan used to have a pretty big culture. Playa del Carmen has a pretty big one. There are some spots in Central America that are really picking up, like San Juan del Sur is picking up. There's also some spots in El Salvador that have like started to gain like a lot of traction. I know that Medellin used to have a really big culture in Buenos Aires as well, although I haven't been to any of those places, but I hear from some of my friends that they're very, very big and like, again, have that culture of just a lot of people there when it's the season for that. Budapest used to, interestingly enough, Kiev in the Ukraine used to have a very big culture, and so did Bansko in Bulgaria, but Bansko is seasonal. I think a lot of people go to ski in the winter. So, there's also like spots that are like very big in summer, but not so big in winter. And I think it's also just kind of going with those spots. I know that Tallinn in Estonia has more adoption now. And I think that could be because they've introduced a digital nomad visa. And so again, like I think something that's really interesting is looking at where certain countries are introducing visas, because they're obviously wanting to invite more of that in, and so there's going to be more infrastructure to support that. So I think there are a lot of really great countries that don't have the community necessarily. Like I really love Sweden, but there isn't a community of nomading there. I really love Berlin as a city, but there isn't a massive community of nomading in Berlin. It's really more people who move there. You know, same with certain cities in the US. It's just like there's not a big nomad community, but they're just excellent cities to like live and be. But it's not like you're around a bunch of nomads, for example, as you are. Like if you go to Lisbon, there will be nomad events where it's like nomads. So yeah, I'd say in terms of overall locations, Bali, Tulum, Playa del Carmen, Nosara, Lisbon, those would be the big ones.
Where in the world do you feel the most at home?
This changes so frequently for me, and my idea of home has shifted so much over the last couple months, or even just over the last couple of years. A realization that I came to recently is that home is simply where the people that I love are. And so a question that I've started asking is less where feels like home and more where are the people that I love? Because wherever they are, that's where home is. And so, you know, one of my best friends lives in Wanaka in New Zealand. One of my best friends just moved to Cayman from the UK. I'm yet to visit her there though. Maybe that will be a this year thing. And one of my best friends lives in Berlin. And so one of my best friends lives in Barcelona. And whenever I go and I spend time with, you know, my close friends, I just feel at home. You know, when I'm with them, I'm like, oh, this is home, your home. But home has really become less of a place and more of a people thing.
Did you start nomadic life with your own business, or did you have a remote job first?
I have actually never had a remote job. Yeah, when I was working in Melbourne, I had very strict roles that were just like, you need to be in the office. And I did have one role where I was able to kind of negotiate with them a little bit, but I've never really had the opportunity to negotiate with an employer and do the whole Tim Ferriss thing where I'm like, hey, like, you know, you can just let me go and work from Thailand, but I'm working here. So I was already in my business when I was nomading and trying to figure out how to do it. But I think, you know, I was definitely in the category of like self-employed and like having clients on retainers versus, you know, having like the big courses and programs business that I've had for the last couple of years.
How do you create a sense of family when yours is so far away? There's a note here. I'll just jump in. Nuclear family versus chosen.
Thank you. Okay. So yeah, when you grow up in like the model of the nuclear family and you're like, cool, you know, my family is like my mom and dad, or my family is like my two moms, my two dads, or like, you know, like my brothers and my sisters, and like the people around me that I am related to by blood and marriage, and that's your construct of family. The first thing that you want to do is be very, very aware that that is a construct, that family can also be something that is not bound by blood or legal contracts. Family is a feeling that you can create. Family is a feeling that you can choose. Family is also something that you can create of your own accord, right? Where it's like you are literally, you know, marrying someone and having your own kids and your own pets, and you can do that. But family is such a fluid thing that I would invite you to ask yourself the question, like, how do I feel a depth of connection that allows me to feel so safe that I'm supported and I'm equally supporting, right? Like, how do I feel that depth of loyalty where it's like, you've got my back, I've got your back, no matter what? Like, what does family even mean to you? Does it mean sharing the same cultural beliefs? Does it mean sharing the same religious or spiritual beliefs? For me, family feels like a, you know, I would take a bullet for you. For me, family feels like a very sacrificial thing of like, I've got your back no matter what, and I would do absolutely anything for you. And so for me, that feeling has really come down to what relationships can I build where I have that depth of generosity, and I have that depth of gifting, and I have that depth of, you know, sacrifice, where they feel like they can call me and I will be there to pick them up. I'll be there to sit in the mud with them and hold them through their darkest days, their hours, and you know, likewise, right? And so it's been a very intentional process for me of going, who in my life, in my network of people, in my network of friends, do I want to go deeper with? Who do I see has the capacity and the interest in building something with me where we have a bond that feels that loyal, where it feels that deep? And it's not necessarily about agreeing on certain things. You know, it's not necessarily about sharing certain attributes. I think it's very helpful when you have common goals and you are like on a similar path, but it's very much like, hey, are you willing to co-create this dynamic with me where we are in this together and we have each other's back and we create this safety, you know, and this level of like being there for each other and with each other. And it's a very intentional thing. And so for me, there's this process of actively choosing family. And I will like say to someone, hey, do you want to do this with me? And I'll say like, you know, I'll make a declaration to someone when I'm like going through this process, and I'll be like, I want to let you know that like I'm there for you, and I will pick you up from the airport, and you can call me whenever and any time of day, and I'll be there and I'll answer the phone, and like, you know, you've got me and I'm in your corner, and like I'll fight for you and I'll be loyal for you. And you know, I kind of make this active declaration, and I'll make a very active intentional effort to build that relationship and to pour into that relationship. And for me, that will look like, you know, texting or calling every so often, pretty regularly, and just being like, hey, how's it going this week? How can I support you? What's going on for you? Or I'll make an active note of things that are happening in that person's life, and I'll be like, how's that going? And what are the updates on this thing? And like, do you need any help with that thing? You know? And so there's just like an active emotional investment in that person's goals or in that person's other relationships. And there's a commitment to helping them achieve whatever it is that they're wanting to achieve, or to better their own lives, and to just make sure that they feel loved, to make sure that they feel acknowledged and seen and witnessed and held, and to let them know that I'm there with them. And, you know, it is this active building, right? So it's like, for me, that idea and that construct of chosen family has been such an intentional thing, where I've been like, I get to decide who my sisters are, and I get to decide who my brothers are. And that's not something you find. It's something that you build, and it's something that happens over time with a lot of consistency. And, you know, it has to go both ways, right? Like, they have to make the decision too, and they have to pour in as much as you do, or like, you know, to a close degree, it's got to be somewhat reciprocal. But I think that that can be accomplished after a year. You know, maybe if you're like both really in it, it can be accomplished after like maybe a couple months, you know. But the more I've held and set that intention of, I want more close friendships that feel like family, and I am willing to put in the work to create that, and I'm willing to be there, and I'm willing to give and give and give and show up in a way that is extremely generous with time, with energy, with emotions, whatever, money, whatever, favors. The more I receive that back, and the more I feel like I have chosen family. But the best way to create that feeling of family is to show up with so much capacity to give, and to really create that connection with other people where you're like, I'm here for you. What do you need? How can I support you? How can I be a pillar for you in your experience of life? And if you show up with an attitude of giving and an attitude of supporting first, then it will be reciprocated, right? If you show up with an attitude of like, oh, how do I just like find family? You know, you don't find these things. It doesn't just like happen, right? You've got to build it actively, and you always build by you making the first offer. It is you making the first move, but you've got to be able to back that up with consistent emotional support, right? And when you do that and you show up in that way, like, life is going to be so kind back to you, and you will have these incredible connections where you feel so held in a way that maybe even your nuclear birth family never did. So you do have to be able to clear a lot of space in your life to have that level of capacity where you're giving that much, right? You obviously, if you're like, oh, I'm so busy, I don't have time for relationships, then it's like, it's going to be hard for you to have that depth. And again, with that like volume of people, right? But if you make relationships a priority, and if you go, cool, I'm going to, reduce some time from this or that, and I'm going to pour into my relationships, then you're going to have that family that you've built. But you do need to put time aside for it.
How do you know when you've found the place to call home, and or does it even exist?
I have, after several years now, come to the conclusion that it doesn't exist. I used to really look for the place, and I spent so much time trying to find the place where I thought I belonged. And I really would come up with all these frameworks of like, oh, this place has a great film scene. This place has a great art scene. This place has a great food culture. And I would look for these things, like, oh, this place is a really good culture of health or spirituality. Or there's a culture of entrepreneurship here. And I would look for these things that had these attributes. And what I've realized is that if you don't foster a true sense of belonging within yourself, there is nowhere in the world that will ever feel like home, because there's always going to be something that has the ability to make you question if you can truly be there, if you can stay there. Like something can like rock you and destabilize you and remove you from your center point. And you'd be like, oh, well, it doesn't have this, or this negative thing happened, and so this must not be it. And it's that same mentality that makes you question a relationship, right? Like if you think about it and you have a good relationship, with a partner, a romantic partner, and you start questioning if the grass is greener somewhere else, and you have this like mindset that is very idealistic, then you might walk away from something good because you're like, oh, what if there's something better out there? And I don't know if this really ticks all the boxes. There is no relationship that is truly going to tick all of your boxes all the time forever. That's not the point. And so I think that if you're looking for a place that's going to tick all of the boxes all the time forever, you are setting yourself up for failure. I think that you want to see a place in the same way that you see a partner, which is just for what it is, right? It's like, you are actively in relationship with this place, or you are actively in relationship with this person, and that requires constant effort or work and support on your end, where you are giving it, like you are pouring into that thing, and you can only expect out of something what you're willing to give. And so rather than constantly focusing on like, what am I getting, ask yourself, like, what am I giving to this thing? What am I giving to this relationship? What am I giving to this place? How am I showing up to this thing? And do I have unrealistic expectations about what it's going to give to me? I think that, a lot of people will expect that a place will make them feel a sense of belonging in the same way that a certain relationship will make them feel, a sense of like something that they're looking for, right? A sense of unconditional, whatever it is. But it's like, if you don't already love yourself, if you don't know how to truly love and accept yourself, there's no relationship in the world that is going to give you the love and acceptance that you're really looking for. And in the same token, when you're looking at a place, there is no place that can really give you the belonging that you're looking for if you don't know how to belong to you.
How do you make peace with the fact that we hate the country where we come from? Is that true for you?
That is not true for me. I do not hate Australia, but I do have some friends who have come from either politically, disruptive environments, or just like war-torn countries, or they could come from environments where there is such a deep undercurrent of religious, like, conservatism that feels so traumatic or damaging that it's really hard to reconcile who you are in your authentic self whenever you go back there and you fundamentally disagree with the political or religious beliefs that are prevalent in that society. And so this is such a great question. I think that when you feel hatred towards a certain set of beliefs, and, you know, usually these are things that are very dogmatic, I would ask the question, it's not even that I'd ask the question, I would reflect on where that hatred is coming from, because I would assume that it's coming from some unintegrated traumatic experiences where it feels like, you know, there's a hyper awareness or potentially a fixation on the negative consequences of those beliefs or of that dogma, right? Where it's like you can see the harm that it has caused to that society, or potentially to people that you love, you know, family, friends, people that you know, that you care about. You see the harm, and there's a lot of awareness and fixation on the negatives, right? It's like, well, you know, this is causing the deaths of many people. This is causing, you know, mental illness or like physical health issues. And I fundamentally disagree with the way that they are running this country. I fundamentally disagree with this political party. You know, I fundamentally disagree with like the way that they live here. How do they not see that this is harmful? How do they not see that this is causing such a negative effect, right? I think when we hold that view, it's very hard to support something because there's a fundamental clash there. It's like, you know, I believe that this is morally creating more harm. So how can I support that, right? Of course I can't support that. Therefore, I have this internal conflict. I have this moral dilemma. And so the way to best combat that internal conflict is to create an opportunity for understanding why they behave in the way that they behave, understanding why they believe what they believe. Like, for every choice, you know, for every decision, there's always something that someone is getting out of that. And so when we disagree with someone, we are primarily looking at why it doesn't work, why it doesn't make sense. And we're looking at what's going wrong, right? But in order to understand and then ultimately have empathy and compassion, you want to hold curiosity and be like, okay, how is this benefiting you? Why do you want to do this? Why have you chosen to continue and to perpetuate, you know, these particular religious beliefs or these particular cultural beliefs or, you know, these opinions or like this way of doing things, these laws, you know, why have you chosen this? Oh, you have this value for safety. Okay. You think that if you do this, that is ultimately in the best interests of this nation or of this group. And you don't have to agree with those decisions. But I think if you can get to a point of curiosity where you can hold more space for the disagreement of the best approach, and you can understand why they think that that's the best, even if, you know, it's illogical to you, that's where you're going to be able to make more peace with that conflict that you feel, right? It's like, well, you know, they have a value for this and I have a value, you know, they have a more conservative value. Maybe I have a more progressive value. And because they have that conservative value, they're making a decision that is ultimately rooted in their desire for safety rather than a desire for more liberation. And maybe the consequence of that is, you know, more disconnection and isolation rather than more interconnectedness, you know, or it's like because they have this particular economic situation that then causes this overspill into like healthcare. And so I would have more curious conversations where you're seeking to listen and truly understand rather than focusing on the difference of opinion or the difference of value. And then be like, you know what? Like, I come from this place. I fundamentally, you know, like I have different values and I disagree, but I understand why they do it that way. And, you know, that's the culture. And I think the more that you go into the history and the more you learn about the particular economic ties and alliances and where those values have come from, the more you understand, the easier it's going to be to then be like, you know, yeah, I get it. And you got to hold that paradox of like, I don't have to agree, I don't have to like it, but I can accept it. And if you can accept it, that hate and that contempt will dissipate. You can't hate something and accept it at the same time. The hate can only be present from resistance.
Would you ever return to Australia?
On my recent trip, and at the time of recording this, being present in Australia, you know, part of one of the things that I wanted to explore was this question of like, could I ever live in Australia again? You know, would I ever come back here to have a family? Would I ever come back here to retire in my older age? And having spent the last 2 months here and traveling around and spending time in different places and meeting different friendship groups from different eras of my life, I don't think that I would ever come back to Australia to live for a multitude of reasons. So as I mentioned like earlier, so many of my close friends live in different parts of the world, and my desire is to be with those closer relationships that have that feeling of depth and commitment and loyalty and allegiance. I think for me personally that there's just this energy with Australia that I don't particularly feel the most supported by in whatever it is that I'm doing, you know? And so like the way that I kind of look at things now when I'm deciding where I want to be is like, what is my number one priority in life? Like, what's my biggest value? What am I trying to cultivate? What am I trying to integrate? What am I trying to achieve? And where is the best environment for me to do that? And so, you know, it's usually something business oriented, or it's maybe something creative, you know, like, oh, I want to, you know, be in the film industry, or I want to be in, you know, this particular thing. And when I think about the dominant things that the Australian environment provides, I can't see any of those things being a high priority for me to desire to integrate at a future point in my life. And so I really have come to the conclusion I don't think that I would ever come back in like a long-term way, and I don't see myself ever living here again.
What are the few things you need to feel like home?
Okay, so the first thing is I need to find a good like gym or like kind of exercise environment where I feel like I can do this sustainably. So I need to find some kind of connection to physical movement or activity. So it's like, okay, you know, can I do Pilates here? Like that's an exercise that I really like. Or like, is there a nice yoga studio here that I can go to like every Sunday for yin? Or, you know, is there like a gym that just feels like, you know, that could become my place? Like, can I find a good personal trainer here? Like there's the physical anchoring to the body is like one of the first things that will make me feel very like at home. And so if there's like a relationship or a connection to like some sort of physical activity that feels like long-term and sustainable, then I'm like, oh, great. You know, like I can be here. Usually having close proximity to some kind of beach, or I can walk on the beach and be near an ocean or a body of water, is a very fast way for me to do that. It's a very fast way for me to feel grounded and connected to the earth and to feel that connection to water. That's usually something that really grounds me very quickly. Another thing that makes me feel very at home is like a sense of, I guess, like spiritual activity or community where, you know, people are engaging in some kind of practice or conversation, and there is a sense of community. For me, like that sense of community where people come together, whether it's coming together at the gym, whether it's coming together like, you know, at the recovery center doing a communal sauna, where people gather. If there's like a culture of gathering, I feel very at home. I feel like, okay, cool. Here's a place that really prioritizes community and gathering. And I think one of the things that I really struggle with in bigger cities, and not every big city, but in a lot of bigger cities, and definitely in Melbourne in particular, where I'm from, is that I don't feel that there is a big culture of gathering, I feel like there is more of a disconnected, isolated culture where people kind of tend to keep to themselves. People gather for sports events here, and I think that's a really big thing, but I'm not a big sport enthusiast. Like, I don't follow football, I don't like cricket, so I don't feel like that is an interest to me to gather in that way. And so obviously there's the gathering itself, but then there's also, what are people gathering to share? Is it the experience of music? Is it the experience of something healthy? And so if it's one of those two things, then I feel very at home. I'm like, oh, cool, we're gathering for like lots of music events. Yeah, fuck yeah. Or like, oh, cool, we're gathering like, for sauna, or we're gathering for like cold plunging. Like that's awesome. For some people it's gathering for runs. People love doing like their marathons or their half marathons. They love running, right? Running's not a thing for me. So it's looking for like the activities that I'm a really big fan of, and I've sort of mentioned a few. Another thing that makes me feel very at home is like having a culture of really enjoying food and having access to like really great quality produce, and that being part of the culture and that being a priority or a value for a place. So, having a culture of health, having a culture of food, having a culture of creativity and art, and a lot of creatives, having that access to a body of water or really good quality nature, physical movement. And I think a really big thing for me is having a culture of innovation and creativity. And so like, are people creating in this environment? Are people coming in with a lot of ideas and, like really exciting movement to build things, to create things, whether that's entrepreneurial endeavors or whether it's scientific endeavors or whether it's more like, books, films, podcasts. Like, is there momentum in this place? Are people creating? Are people collaborating? Is there traction and is there excitement and buzz? So for me, that is a really big thing. And, I think that different cities kind of have their moments. Like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Silicon Valley was like, it had so much momentum, like in the tech space. And I think that different cities have different periods of momentum for whatever it is that you're exploring, right? Like if I was engaging in music, I would move to Berlin, hands down. I think for what I'm doing right now, Austin feels like a really great buzzy place that has become a place with a lot of traction and momentum over the last probably 3 years. So that feels like something that really facilitates a lot of what I'm looking for.
All right, this next question. How do you stay grounded while always moving, and do you maintain self-care practices? How do you stay regulated when there is so much constant change and uncertainty?
I try to exercise as soon as I get to a place or find a way to engage in some kind of physical movement. I will look in advance to see if there are places with classes or if there's like, a personal trainer, or I'll ask friends, like, do you know someone? The sooner I physically move my body and find something that feels like a sustainable routine, the sooner I feel grounded. I will look for little things, like maybe I'll like burn incense, or I'll go for a particular walk in the same place. And it really is repetition. So it's like if you're going to the same gym, after you go 5 times, you're going to feel really at home and you're going to feel really at ease. If you're constantly going to new places, even cafes, like if you go to the same cafe and you go a certain number of times, you're going to feel really familiar. And so think about it like this, like the more reps you do, the more familiarity you create, the more familiarity you have, the more grounded you feel, the more at home you feel. So you want to create that sense of familiarity by going to the same places and doing the same things. And that is like the opposite of novelty and overwhelm, right? So it's, it's a scale, and there are levers that you can pull on both ends of that scale where it's like, cool, I want to up the novelty and I want to up the dopamine versus I want to up the familiarity and I want to up the grounding. And you can do that in the same city that you live in. You can do that in new cities. But ultimately, the more you go to the same place and the more you see the same people, the more grounded you're going to feel. But exercise is definitely the fastest way.
After that, how do you build friendships so quickly?
My strategy for building friendships in a new city is co-working spaces and going to like recovery centers, like where you can sauna and cold plunge. And essentially like I will listen to a lot of the conversations that are happening in those environments. And the moment that there's an opening, where I'm like, oh, cool, I really agree with this. Or like, oh, I'm, that's a hobby of mine. Or like, I'm a fan of that. Like, I will engage in the conversation and I will make an effort to contribute to that conversation or that dialogue. I'll make an effort to ask questions, and I will make an effort to ask people what they're doing and ask if I can attend those events. I'll be like, oh, cool, like, what are you guys doing this weekend? Or like, what's on next week? Or where do you work? Or what events are coming up? Like, what are you doing? And can I participate in these activities? And again, like, the more you're going to the same places, right? Like, the more you're going to the same gym, the more you're going to the same recovery center, the same co-working space, the more you're going to see the same people. And when they see your face continuously, they will feel like, oh, cool, this person is here now. They live here now, and they'll be more open and they'll be more receptive to you then initiating that sense of request for participation. So it's kind of like, again, you do the reps to like show up to the same place. You then, make the active intention and effort to listen. Then you kind of ask to participate. And then as you sort of start to participate in like the activities, then you can sort of start to, engage in interesting conversation. You can make offers of like, hey, here's what I can offer you, like in terms of conversation or interest or like support. And I would love to get to know you. Would you be interested in going out for coffee, or would you be interested in doing this? And so it's kind of like you sort of start with those, initial touch points, and then you make an offer to, engage with someone at that deeper level of like, oh, I'd really love to get to know you better. Would you be up for that? And then you sort of create that opening for deeper connection. And then as that starts to progress after some weeks or months, you can make that offer for even more solidified friendship. And that's kind of my process.
So on that, how do you maintain friendships when you're always traveling or with people who live across the world?
I very actively voice memo people a lot. I find that voice and video calls also, but voice is really great, right? Like, I'm a very big voice memo enthusiast, and it's really funny because sometimes, when I have like a new friendship, people are often like, oh, I don't like voice memos. And I'm like, yeah. When you're friends with me, you will actually actively become a voice memo person, because you'll see that it's such a great way to maintain that closeness with someone where like there's no obligation for you to listen to that right now. So in my process, I think it's really important that when you are maintaining connection with people, that you don't have a feeling of obligation, and that people don't feel stressed or overwhelmed, like somehow they need to listen to all these voice notes, right? So my process with my friends is like, you can voice memo me as much as you want. And if it's urgent, just like send me a text that says, this is urgent, need you now, or like, can you get on the phone right now, or I need you to listen, like, can you get back to me by tomorrow? But if it's non-urgent, then I'm just going to listen to it whenever I have time. And that's going to be when I'm going for a walk, or when I'm in a car, like when I'm in an Uber, whenever I'm like in transit somewhere, maybe I'm on a plane or something, I'm just going to listen to it in my own time, and I'm going to get back to you in my own time. And then that kind of makes connection feel really, really easy, because the connection just slots into your life whenever you have available time, rather than it always feeling like this thing that you need to get back to. And so people always feel like they can contact me, and they also know that it's not a burden. And then likewise, I just say to people like, you don't have to feel like you need to get back to me. If I really need you, I'm just going to say directly, I need you right now. Are you available? So I will, for my close friends, we talk sometimes daily, sometimes like, 2-3 times a week, maybe weekly. And, it's kind of the frequency will sort of change depending on the closeness of that relationship. But a lot of voice notes, a lot of active follow-up of like, how's this thing going? And then, for my close friends, I'll try and see them in like concentrated chunks, for maybe like a week or a couple weeks, a few times a year. And so I will actively go to them. They might come to me. We'll arrange to meet each other. And if I'm lucky, or if we're lucky, we might have like a longer period of time that's like 3 months together or something like that, depending on, who's living where. And, some of my friends do travel as well. Like some of them are nomads, or some of them are just frequent travelers. So we get the opportunity to kind of see each other a few times a year, and it's not that hard.
Have you found a country or city where you see yourself living permanently?
The cities that feel like they have the most like sustainable resonance for me feel like LA, Austin, Barcelona. There could be more that I just haven't had the opportunity to explore yet. So we'll find out. I definitely feel like I'm probably always going to need to have multiple bases. There's always this give and take. There's always this like compromise. And I also think that, you know, when I'm focusing on career building and creative progression, that's going to have a very different energy to when I'm focusing maybe on wanting to have a family or wanting to have a more quiet life that is maybe perhaps more in nature versus so oriented towards like buzz and busyness. So I definitely feel like there will just be movements. You know, I can definitely see myself in America for the next couple of years, and I can see myself probably settling down in Europe later in life and really desiring that slowness. But right now I feel like I'm in a season of a lot of excitement and a lot of like wanting to build, a lot of wanting to create, wanting to ride the momentum as much as I have disdain towards capitalism, wanting to kind of like ride the train that can provide, and then probably making that transition into a more European way of living later on.
So how do you decide where to go?
I have such a like spontaneous way of, it's like kind of this combination of like, people will just message me and be like, hey, you know, you should come here. Or like, hey, you know, there's this thing on. People will often tell me what they're doing. And I'll be like, oh yeah, I should come see you. And a lot of the travel is oriented around my relationships, friendships, and me desiring to go and see people, or people inviting me to certain events that pique my interest. So for example, like I'm talking in Miami next month, and that I had no plans to go to Miami. I probably wouldn't be interested in going to Miami, but it is something that I've always been curious about. But it's not somewhere where I would be like, oh, I can't wait to go to Miami. I've got to do it. Versus like, if someone says, hey, you know, I want you to give a talk here, I'd be like, oh yeah, cool. You know, that makes sense. And that's actually really, you know, I can go and do all these other things. That'll be really interesting. So a lot of the time it's like, there are either like business events or conferences, or there might be like festivals where I'll be like, oh, I really want to go to this thing. Or maybe like one of my favorite like DJs or comedians or something is performing and I want to go and I want to see that. And then while I'm there, I will turn it into a trip. You know, like I went to A Fest in 2022, which was in Jordan. And I was like, oh, it's actually, I didn't even think about like, you know, Jordan being on my bucket list. But while I was there, I was like, I obviously want to go to Petra, and I obviously, you know, want to go on a road trip and like check out the countryside and like, you know, do as much of this as I can while I'm here. So sometimes it's oriented around events, sometimes it's oriented around people, and then sometimes it is bucket list stuff where it's like, oh, Egypt has been on my list for such a long time. And then the opportunity comes up to this like special trip, and then I go and I do that. So it's kind of like those three things that will sort of balance each other out. It'll be like bucket list, friends, events.
How do you navigate visas and tax obligations?
So visas are probably the most complicated thing. When I'm in Europe, I'm just in there on the like Australian, EU, you know, we get to stay up to 90 days in the Schengen region. Outside of the Schengen, it's different for certain places. So for example, within the UK, I can stay for up to 6 months before I need to leave. I've never actually applied for a proper European visa. I know that you can get a 12-month working visa pretty easily. I've looked into that, and I've had friends tell me all about that, and that might be something that I do at a later date. You can also, probably one of the easiest places to sort of get access to is Europe, because you do need to just make a donation. And so you can kind of you can buy a property. And I think one of the easiest places to do that is Malta. And then once you get into Malta, that will give you certain access to like the rest of the EU. So it's pretty easy to look into that. But, you know, in terms of, obviously the EU is easy because you have that whole connection of European countries in the Union, versus like America is quite challenging. So as an Australian, we have this agreement that says that you just apply for an ESTA, which is like a visa waiver that says you don't need a visa. You can go in for 90 days at a time. As long as you're not working there and you're just visiting and you're going to events and you're sort of holidaying or traveling, you know, that's fine. I'm currently in the process of applying for a proper visa for the United States that will allow me to live and work there for 4 years. Should hopefully come through in the next couple months. Asia is pretty easy. With Asia, obviously it varies country to country, but a lot of the time in Asia, it's kind of less bureaucratic and more financial or economic, let's say. So if you want to live somewhere, it's usually just like you go and you ask people and you figure out like, hey, what's the easiest visa for me to get? And they'll tell you. And it's usually just a matter of like paying a certain amount of money, signing some documents, putting your fingerprints on certain documents. And you can usually kind of buy a visa for a year or 2 years. And, it's a little bit gray. Obviously, the laws in Asia are a little bit different. They're less bureaucratic than in Western countries, right? There are certain countries that are more obviously bureaucratic. Like let's say Japan is probably going to be way more bureaucratic than like, let's say Thailand, right? So if you want a visa for Indonesia, there are so many different things that you can get. One of the easiest ones that most people get is the 6-month working visa, which is very cheap. You can go in for 6 months. If you leave, it expires. You can't hop in and out. So if you're in for 6 months, you're kind of in, and then you would need a new one, but that's a really easy one to get. Otherwise, there are various forms of visa called kitas, and there are ones where, you can stay for like 2 years, but you can just renew it really easily. And that's sort of the one that most people will be on. That's the one that I've been on for several years. And that will, give you way more rights. So it's actually not that hard to figure out the visa stuff once you're in and you have more friends and you can sort of be like, okay, cool. And there's usually a lot of visa agents. So wherever you're going, I would just Google like visa agent, and then you can sort of pay this agency to help you with the process to make it a lot easier for you. Like even with my US visa, I could do that all myself, but I would not want to. So I've paid an immigration lawyer in lieu of an agent to essentially help me and walk me through that process step by step. So that's the visa side. In regards to the tax side, you legally have to be a tax resident of a country. So you are legally obligated to pay taxes in whatever country you are a resident in, where you reside. Usually the laws around residency, it's like you have to be residing in that place for 180 days. That means that you are a resident there. So I haven't been a resident of Australia since early 2019. And my residency, where I have legally resided for the majority of my time, has been in Indonesia. And so that's where I reside, and that's where I have my obligations financially. But if you are in a country where you're residing for more than 180 days, then you might be obligated to pay taxes in that country. So it's rare that you would not have a visa for a place, but that you would be there for more than 180 days and that you would be liable to be paying taxes there. So usually like where you have your visa is where you're going to be residing. And then that is something that you're going to have to look into and be like, okay, cool, I'm obligated to pay this here. But if you're constantly moving from place to place and you don't have like a base, then it's usually going to default back to your country of origin. So if you're Canadian, but you're always moving, it's going to default back to Canada because you're not residing anywhere for more than 180 days of the year. Only country in the world, I believe, that you are obligated to pay taxes in, even if you're no longer living there, is America. So if you are an American citizen, you will be obligated to always pay taxes in America, even if you are residing in Thailand, and you'll be obligated to pay taxes in both countries. There are certain waivers or partnerships or treaties, I think they're called, where you might have certain exemptions where it's like, oh, if you have this thing here, then, there's a treaty with this other country. And so that means that you have some kind of special thing. So the best thing that you can do when you become a nomad or when you opt for the global citizen life is to find a really good international tax lawyer that can educate you on what your obligations are based on what kind of lifestyle you want to have. Like I said, earlier, there are so many different ways that you can do this, and you can do it where you're constantly moving, in which case you'd be defaulting to your country of origin, or you can do it the way that I've done it, where I've basically had Bali as a base for the last 4 years. And so my residence and my obligations have been to Indonesia, but there's just been lots of travel in between that. Be mindful of the 180-day rule, but you want to get a good visa agent and you want to get a good tax lawyer that can make sure that you have the information, and there are courses that you can do, but, I personally would want to have a good lawyer. It's not that expensive to even just have an initial consult before you actually change anything legally on paperwork.
And finally, how much does it actually cost to live comfortably in Bali And what's the criteria to qualify for a visa?
This is something that really bothers me because I feel like I've seen so many people say that it's so cheap to live in Bali, and they do this maths that literally just does not add up. Like they will be like, yeah, you can live in Bali for like $900 a month. You know, like you can live in Bali for like $1,300 a month. And I'm like, where are you going? Like, what are you talking about? And I've seen so many travel influencers share these absolutely incorrect, distorted prices. Bali is not that cheap to live in. Like it is very much a sliding scale of like how comfortable you want to be and how luxurious you want to live. But this kind of idea that you can live there for $1,000 a month is so completely absurd that like it's so wrong. Like a lot of the quotes are just like out of this world incorrect. So in my experience, and obviously like my lifestyle has adjusted over the last 4 years from 2019 when I first got there to now. And I also think that as we've had rising inflation globally and, you know, again, through just more people moving there, prices have really gone up. When I first got to Bali, I was living there for about, I would say 2,000 USD, 3,000 Australian per month. And that was pretty lean, comfortable, not luxurious, you know, living in a shared villa with housemates. Back then, you could get a room in a decent villa for maybe like $800 to $1,000 a month of rent, which is really not that cheap. Like that's what you would pay living in a Western country for rent in a shared place, right? Like rent is actually quite expensive in Bali. Like it's very hard to find something cheap because so many people want to live there. And so they know, and you have the economics of supply and demand happening, not in your favor. Rent is definitely the most expensive thing. I would say it's a probably very similar cost of living to certain parts of Australia and New Zealand, to be really, really honest. Like if you are earning in US dollars or like in euros, then it's very much in your favor. But if you're from like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you know, the currency conversion is just probably going to be not that much in your favor. Like the cost of living is going to be very similar to certain parts. Now, with my current lifestyle, my current way of living being like not sharing with people, living alone, living in a slightly nicer place, a slightly newer place, I would probably spend closer to $4,000 or $5,000 a month living in Bali with all of the amenities and the add-ons of like, you know, having facials and going to the spa regularly, getting massages regularly, you know, having certain appointments for like acupuncture or, you know, physio or chiropractic or like breath work, things like that. So I'd say like the range, if we're going US dollars, is probably more like 2,000, like 2,500 on the low end to like 5,000, like 4,000 or 5,000 on the high end per month, realistically. Thanks for tuning in to our episode on life as a digital nomad and global citizen. I hope that you learned a lot in this episode. In our next one, we're going to expand a lot more on these themes of belonging and home, which I think is a really big topic for so many of you, whether you are nomadic or not. You know, this feeling of like, where do I belong in the world? What if I don't feel like I belong where I've come from? And it's going to be a really, really good one. I'm going to share a lot more about my recent trip to Australia and some of the really big lessons that I've learned and integrated during my time here. So make sure you tune in next week for our episode on the paradox of belonging and my quest for home.